Before we get started, there will be spoilers for the 1000-Year Blood War arc of Bleach in the video to come. So, last month we took the strongest, most broken Schrifts in Bleach and ranked them in an attempt to figure out which was the best overall, all the while trying to separate them from their respective Sternritter as much as possible at the same time. To be honest, it wasn't easy. Now, while I'm fairly happy with how the list turned out in the end, there's no denying that nothing is set in stone. At the end of the day, the Schrift in general are just incredibly busted for the most part, making choosing just a few to sit atop the hierarchy a Herculean task. Which is why we are back again today, except this time we are flipping the script and taking a look at the Schrifts on the other end of the spectrum. As explained in that previous video, the Schrift are perhaps the most consequential new addition to the series as of the final arc, laying the groundwork for the Sternritter's entire power system. Thanks to his ability to see words of power emblazoned upon the souls of others, Yhwach is able to bestow upon his children something that completes them, by carving a letter into their very being, thus awakening an incredible ability unique to that Sternritter. And while many of these powers helped lay waste to the Soul Society throughout the final arc, there are some that simply don't measure up to the rest, for one reason or another. Again, attempting to separate them from their respective Sternritter as much as possible, in today's video we are going to rank the worst or weakest Schrift in Bleach, using much the same criteria as we did last time. Now, you may have noticed that there are considerably fewer entries in this video compared with the last one, and that's just due to the simple fact that really, most Schrift are pretty good. It was very hard to find any that felt truly lacking, and even the ones that made this list for the most part aren't exactly bad per se, they're just worse in comparison to the rest. We don't even really need any ground rules this time, as none of the Schutzstoffel Schrift are going to be popping up here, and certainly neither is Yhwach. I guess the only point to note is, like I said, once again, I'll be trying my best to rank the Schrift based on the Schrift itself and solely the Schrift, trying to ignore the Sternritter in question, though often that is easier said than done. And so, as with last time, we'll see how we get on. You might notice that there is a direct correlation between some of the weakest, or I suppose the worst performing Schrift in the series, and the less popular, less fleshed out Sternritter. At least, I think there is anyway. And so, without further ado, let's take a trip into the weird and wacky world of the Quincy and their holy powers for a second time. Once again, this was a really difficult list to make. Honestly, it was harder than the last list, I think, because there's just not as clear a race to the bottom when it comes to the Schrift. And so, as always, please do let me know your own thoughts and your own lists down in the comments below. But anyway, that's enough stalling. Let's kick things off with some honourable mentions. Schrift that could be seen as potentially weak or lacking in utility, but for one reason or another, I didn't feel should actually make the list proper, and in actuality, there's only one this time. And so, first up on our list, and the only honourable mention this time around, is a Schrift that also made the honourable mention spot in our strongest Schrift video as well, meaning it really does toe the line between the two. And that's the Glutton. So how can the Glutton make it onto both lists? Well, the thing is, the Glutton only really becomes stupidly good when you take the supplementary material, the light novels, into account. Because it's only in Can't Fear Your Own World where it's revealed that the Glutton assimilates the powers and abilities of those it devours into its user, which is an incredible, game-changing addition to its power. But if you only had the source material to go by, if that was all you'd read, then the Glutton definitely seems a little lacking by comparison. It's unwieldy, it's situational, and doesn't provide the user with any additional benefits. Sure, it's shown to be capable of consuming numerous Shinigami officers at once in a gruesome fashion, but really if a Schrift couldn't kill a bunch of officers, I'd be really worried. That's pretty much the lowest bar, and will be mostly how we measure the Schrift to come. Lil Toto uses the glutton to kill Pepe, but he inexplicably doesn't even try to fight back. So for me, that's why it shows up on both lists in the honourable mention spot. Depending on what you've read, and the original story is what I imagine roughly 90% of fans will actually know, the glutton might either be kind of broken or simply not that great. Now, while I said there was only one honourable mention this time around, and I am sticking by that, there was another Schrift that very nearly made the honourable mention spot, and I'd like to get your take on it, and that's the jail. The jail is, of course, extremely powerful. It allows its user to fire an arrow that entraps non-Quincy targets in an impenetrable, inescapable jail. And that seems to me like it's pretty good. It does what it sets out to do with maximum efficiency. The issue with the jail, then, is just how situational it is, to the point where Kyuge Obi felt like he didn't even have a Schrift for the vast majority of his screen time, for the vast majority of his time as a villain in the 1000-Year Blood War arc. And so to me, that's why I didn't include it, but why I was so close to including it, and why I would love your take on things. Does the jail deserve a mention on the honourable mentions part of this video or not? For me, this is a really, really weird one. This is a Schrift that is so laser focused, so purpose built for one specific job, that it feels so completely different to every other Schrift in the series. It is unlike the rest of the Sternritter's abilities entirely. And that doesn't make it weak, that doesn't make it bad. In fact, it accomplishes what it needs to perfectly. Ichigo would have possibly never escaped the jail had he not awakened accidentally the Quincy powers within him. And so to me it feels a little unfair to include the jail on here, but really its utility is very lacking. It has no versatility, and it really is only useful in one circumstance. It can't really do anything else. But what it does do, it does very well, so I'm not entirely sure whether it should be on here or not. So that's why this isn't an official placement for the jail, but I'd love to hear what you think down in the comments below. Okay, but moving on to our actual list, and guess what? Kicking off this list for real is, yes, another Schrift that appeared on our strongest Schrift list as well. That's really not easy to say. I told you there really aren't many of these Sternritter holy powers that are singularly not great. Generally speaking, they are all pretty good. But in 7th place here we have the Viability, Shaz Domino's Schrift, that only appeared in the supplementary short story The Beginning of the Revive of Tomorrow. The Viability, which later comes to be known as the Stigma, heals Shaz's wounds on a continuous basis by absorbing the reishi around him. To this end, Shaz is even able to automatically replace lost limbs, and by replacing his entire body over time, he was even able to escape his creator Gremmy's control. So I mean, that sounds pretty good, right? And, well, it is. Like I said, most of these really aren't that bad at all, and I will be stressing that throughout the video. The Viability just scrapes its way onto this list, however, because unlike most Schrift in the series, it seems like the user has really no control over this power whatsoever. It is a totally automatic passive Schrift. Whenever Shaz is injured, his body will automatically heal itself, but this is used against him to great effect by Izuru in their battle. During their fight, Izuru manages to force Shaz to the ground and injure him severely, thereby causing the Viability to activate. The Viability then absorbs the ground beneath Shaz into himself on a constant basis, as he is caught in a loop, his body continuously healing itself as he is buried deeper and deeper into the earth. If Shaz, like virtually every other Sternritter, could simply use the viability whenever he deemed it necessary, if he could effectively turn it on and off, he'd have escaped his fate. So again, this really isn't a bad ability, hence its position at number 7 on this list, but it does have what I feel is a pretty glaring weakness. Now, in 6th place, we have the Overkill, a Schrift that originally wouldn't have made it on here at all. However, due to some fairly big nerfs that this ability has recently received, I think it is fair to place the Overkill on here for the time being. The Overkill is a pretty simplistic Schrift as far as Sternritter abilities go. The more living things Driscoll kills, the stronger he becomes. And those living things aren't just limited to enemies. Driscoll can also kill both allies and beasts to further increase his power. On the surface, again, this sounds pretty great. It's a Schrift with the potential for exponential growth, and Driscoll recounts just how many people he had killed during his tenure in the war so far. He killed 100 Shinigami, including Sasakibe, during his first incursion into the Serete, and then 100 again the second time he arrived. That first 100 or so made him more than strong enough to kill Sasakibe in what appears to be a single hit, and so it's likely Hisagi would have suffered the same fate had Yamamoto not arrived to save him. Unfortunately for the Overkill, however, not all good things can last. For a long time, we had speculated on whether or not the power boost afforded by the Overkill was permanent, or if it disappeared after a while. We really didn't know. But Kubo finally gave us an answer, revealing on Club Outside that the Overkill's power boost does in fact reset, and in actuality it really doesn't take a lot to bring the user right back down to 0 again. Driscoll needs only to eat, sleep, or faint, and his accumulated power completely vanishes. Now, being knocked unconscious, I can understand that, but eating and sleeping are basic needs. And so realistically then, the gathered power is only going to last a day or two at max, meaning there is a lot of work required with the Overkill to get it to a level once again that's actually worthwhile. So, while it's true that the Overkill still has the possibility for limitless growth, which is why it's only at 6th here on the list, it is now effectively impossible to achieve without being seriously detrimental to the overall health of the user. Okay, and in 5th place on our list today, we have the Underbelly, a strange Schrift that doesn't get a lot of time in the spotlight. Now, I know what you're thinking. But Tom, the Underbelly was capable of rendering even Sosuke Aizen immobile for a few minutes. Isn't that alone a showcase of its power? And yeah, once again, absolutely it is. If the Underbelly is able to be used to full effect, then it's clearly quite nasty. But there is more to it than that. First, what exactly does the Underbelly do, as it is one of the weirdest Schrifts in a sea of already kind of weird abilities? Well, the user needs to spend a fair bit of time observing their opponent before they can even activate it, as they need to scope out the full picture of their Reiatsu beforehand. Once they have successfully observed their target, the user then needs to hit them with a giant U made of glittering orange reishi, at which point the pattern of the target's Reiatsu is exposed. The wielder of the Underbelly then uses the pattern, which takes the form of a grid-like overlay, to exploit holes in the target's Reiatsu, allowing them to then strike them and deal massive damage to the opponent. Nanana uses this power against Aizen, picking his Reiatsu apart and blasting him from afar, even managing to briefly stun the all-powerful Shinigami. The problem with the Underbelly, though, lies in its considerable amount of setup required. Not only does Nanana need to spend a long time observing his target, presumably without interruption. Bear in mind, the only time we see him using his power is when A, Renji is asleep for hours on end, and B, when the Shinigami are all standing around and talking, not even engaged in combat. We'll get to Byakuya later. But he then needs to be able to land his grid overlay in the first place. He even notes that it is much easier to use his Schrift on someone that isn't moving. And then there's the fact that Nanana paralysing Aizen is slightly less impressive than first thought, when you note that Nanana believes the holes in Aizen's Reiatsu are only exposed or even there in the first place because of his Muken prison garb. Were he not wearing that, perhaps Nanana wouldn't have been able to pick apart his Reiatsu at all. And then speaking of Byakuya, we see that wearing the Oken robes completely shuts down the underbelly to the point where it doesn't work at all. So in my opinion, again, while the underbelly packs a real punch, it takes a lot of work to get there. It feels unnecessarily convoluted and simply isn't as efficient as 90% of other Schrift in the series. Now, it almost feels a little unfair to place this next Schrift on the list at all. We really don't have a great view of how the question works, but from what little we've seen, it seems like another Schrift that is very convoluted, very abstract, and just a lot of work. With the question, the user can object to someone's actions or even their very existence, and in doing so forces their target to overcome that objection, or else they are penalised. But the truth is, we really don't know what any of this means. What form does the penalty take? How easy is it for the target to overcome the question itself? How much of the question does someone need to listen to in order to be affected? We know from its very brief appearance in the source material that the question doesn't work if the target can't hear them or if the user can't speak properly. But the thing is, Kenpachi clearly can hear Berenice at least a little bit, as he mentions that Berenice spoke of objecting to his existence. So either Berenice was monologuing way too much, or if they had begun the initiation of the question fully, then perhaps it takes a little while to get going, which would be even worse. Either way, you clearly don't have to be fully deaf in order to prevent the question from working, it seems. Kenpachi merely states that his ears were ringing, so he couldn't hear him too well, and that was apparently enough to stop Berenice's power from taking hold. Unless Berenice's power hadn't actually activated yet, either answer, either scenario presents a pretty bad outlook for the question as a Schrift. Ultimately, though, we don't know much about it, and so I don't feel great putting it here. Like I said, it doesn't seem particularly fair, but hey, from everything I've gleaned of this power, it seems very underwhelming. Okay, and so we have reached the top 3. These Schrift have the dubious honour of being here, and to be honest, it is here where we've reached the Schrift I don't think really stack up to the rest in any way, shape or form. Again, that doesn't mean they don't have advantages unique to them, and it doesn't mean they can't impress in their own way either, as most of the Schrifts, as we've said before, are generally powerful, but these 3 are the most lacking in my opinion. And so in third place we have, perhaps ironically, the power. The power grants its user superhuman strength, allowing them such feats as lifting entire castle blocks over their head with ease, or sending powerful characters like Ichigo and Kenpachi flying with simple punches. Meninas is seen using the power on several occasions, and even inflates her own muscles with the Schrift at one point, though to what effect we don't really know. This is yet another one of those Schrift that just feels underwhelming to me. It's great for killing mooks, but most Schrift are in one way or another. I get the impression, personally, that the power's usefulness drops off dramatically when used against considerably stronger captain-level enemies. I mean, ultimately, what use is superhuman strength on a battlefield filled with superhuman characters. Now, I know that she comes up against both Ichigo and Kenpachi, so she was never likely to get a great showing, but Meninas punches Lil Toto square in the face at point-blank range with her The Power-enhanced arm, and Lil Toto walks away with barely a bruise. Earlier, Meninas lands a direct surprise hit on a severely weakened Kenpachi's back, and he still gets up again. It's only after being blasted numerous times by the Thunderbolt instead that does he finally stay down. And against Ichigo, well, Meninas doesn't really achieve anything at all, even after blindsiding him and smashing him through several buildings. Yeah, the power has never impressed me, to be honest, and it feels very lacking in utility in comparison to most other Schrift, which is a trend we will see in all these top three. It saddens me to have to put the Iron in second place, considering Kangdu is one of my favourite Sternritter, but truthfully his Schrift just isn't that good. It's just not special in any way, shape or form. Again, it's not that the Iron is bad per se, it's just that it has no versatility, barely any utility, to be honest, and it suffers from a similar issue to the Power in the sense that it's just a slightly better, improved version of something everyone already has access to, all of the Sternritter at least. The Iron covers the user's skin in a layer of impenetrable metal, allowing them to deflect sword strikes with ease. And that's really it. Again, this is something that every Sternritter can already do to some degree thanks to Bleach Vein. Remember when Asnod just batted Zabimaru aside in the first invasion? Isn't it crazy when you look at the spectrum of Schrift? On the one hand, you have Schrift that can achieve the impossible, conjure miracles, and revive the user from the dead over and over again, and that is all just packaged in one Schrift, by the way. And then over here you have a layer of metal on your skin. It's not exactly fair. Like most Schrift though, the Iron is a tricky one. Again, we don't know a lot about it. What are its limitations? The fact that Kang fairly casually blocks Hashwolf's sword is kind of impressive, especially since Hashwolf was trying to kill him. This is the same guy, by the way, who effortlessly carves through Basby like it's nothing. Kangdu also blocks Hitsugaya's sword too, meaning he's basically got access to a shield that allows him to repel captain-level sword strikes and slashes. Though if I'm being totally honest again, I think most Sternritter could have blocked Hitsugaya's attack in that instance simply using Bleach Vein. And also, despite this, he loses to Hitsugaya later on anyway. So where exactly is the Iron when Kang is frozen, when he's seemingly needed it the most? Is it just completely useless in that scenario? I mean, I guess it would be. I never really thought of that before, but Hitsugaya is kind of a bad matchup for Kangdu in the sense that, well, what is a layer of metal going to do when your entire body is encased in ice anyway? Hitsugaya is never likely to kill Kang by impaling him or slashing him even, so the Iron feels kind of useless here. I also wonder if perhaps the user is unable to fight properly with the Iron active, which would maybe explain why he didn't use it. This is pure speculation on my part, but imagine if they had to be immobile in order to activate the Iron. I mean, that would just make it even worse. So yeah, the Iron isn't particularly great. It's unique in the sense that its worth and value isn't found in how many people it can kill, how many low-level officers it can kill, or how powerful it is. And so I guess it's good at what it can do, but what it can do isn't a lot. I wish we'd seen it in action a little bit more. Its actual appearance always felt like an afterthought to me, but there you go. But in my opinion, the worst or weakest Schrift of the bunch is the Roar. The Roar is so lame, so underwhelming, that it really does feel like it totally pales in comparison to the rest. And I did rack my brain trying to decide which should take this so-called top spot for a while before finally settling on this one. and I think it makes sense. The roar transforms its user into a gigantic beast, after which they can unleash terrible roars that send rippling sonic shockwaves out across the battlefield, the power of which is enough to kill low-level Shinigami officers in the vicinity, bursting their heads under the pressure. I guess again, in a sense, it's not terrible. It was still capable of killing Gotei 13 soldiers, but it really is lacking in almost every way, and feels extremely limited to me. First of all, save for causing an irritating ringing in his ears, the roar had zero effect on Kenpachi whatsoever, even though he was right behind the Sternritter at the time. Unless, of course, the roar only works in a kind of cone shape, which makes it even worse than it was already. And while I know it's Kenpachi of all characters, he was far from his strongest self at this point. And that means Jerome's roars likely wouldn't have impacted any of the other captains either. Perhaps it wouldn't have even affected most vice captains outside of forcing them back and injuring them a little bit, and that's the entire essence of what this power can do. Transforming into an enormous ape also leaves the user much more open to counterattack, turning them into a bigger target for little to no reason at all. Again, like the question before it, we don't know much about the roar, but ultimately I think we see its utility played out in full. I do wonder what transforming does for Jerome himself, if anything. How much physically stronger does he become? Is he faster? Is he slower? Sturdier? Or is he really just a walking, lumbering target now? Considering Kenpachi kills him in a single strike, I'm inclined to believe it doesn't do much for him at all. As we reach the end of this video, the roar feels to me like it represents the very worst of what the Schrift have to offer. A stunted ability with no room for versatility or adaptation. Its range, by which I mean what it can do and how it can be used, is clearly very contained, very, very limited. What you see is what you get with the roar, and ultimately that's not a lot. Sure, it can clean up random low-level fodder, but again, that's the baseline requirement for virtually every other Schrift in the series. And so that's it for my list of the overall weakest or worst, however you want to word it, Schrift in Bleach. It was a slightly shorter one this time, though no less difficult to decide upon. Unlike the strongest Schrift list before it, this one didn't have a guaranteed obvious pick for the top spot, so there were some wrestling for that unfortunate honour. But like I said, make sure to let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. How do you feel about this list? Do you think it's right? Do you think I'm completely off base? Do our lists share any similarities? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. How do you feel about the Glutton being an honourable mention? Would you have added the jail like I was thinking of doing as well? As always, I would love to hear all of your thoughts down in the comments below. And as always, I want to end the video by saying a massive thank you and giving a huge shout out to my wonderful supporters over on Patreon, without whom I simply couldn't do this. If you like what I do here over on YouTube and you also want to support me over on Patreon as well, thank you. By supporting me at the $1 a month tier, you can get your name in the credits of every single video just like this. And by supporting me at the $2 tier or higher, you can get access to every single one of my videos completely free of baked-in YouTube ads. Alright guys, that's it for the video. As always, I really do hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.